We have a wonderful program for you tonight. You're going to hear from some of the world's leaders in sustainability. We'll have an opportunity to hear their thoughts on a number of questions that we've prepared for them in advance. Then you'll have an opportunity to ask us some questions from the floor. And perhaps most importantly, at the end of the formal event, we'll have wine, beer, and hors d'oeuvres, and you can ask that difficult question that you didn't want to embarrass us about while we're all on stage. So it should be a very pleasant evening. It's an extremely important topic. I know you wouldn't be here if you didn't believe that. So our discussion is entitled The State of Sustainability Policy, Progress and Opportunity. And my colleagues here really represent the best and the brightest on this topic. First here on my immediate left is Steve Cohen, who is the Executive Director of the Earth Institute and Professor here at the School of International and Public Affairs. Some of you have seen Steve already from his picture in the Huffington Post. He writes a regular column or a blog on sustainability and environmental policy. And he's written a new book along with two of his supporting colleagues, myself and Allison Miller, on sustainability policy. And it's trending right now on Amazon. I'm sure after you go home tonight, we're going to go through the roof. Our goal is to be 125,000. That's our goal, and maybe someday we'll get there. 2 seats over is Nilda Mesa. Nilda is the head of a new office in the city, the Office of Sustainability for the City of New York. Nilda, even though she just broke 30, has like an incredible career, which means, as I calculated, she started in executive positions in the government when she was 12, but I guess that's possible. Prior to joining the de Blasio administration, she was here at Columbia University in a number of major positions related to sustainability. Prior to that, she was at the White House on sustainability and environmental policy. She also served at the EPA, with the Air Force, and with the Attorney General's Office of California. So it is amazing by 30 someone could accomplish all those things. Andrew Rifkin, again, is right here at the end of the table. I'm sure, again, he's somebody you recognize from his picture in the New York Times. He's a long-term, award-winning journalist. He is a master of all mediums, not just writing, but also film and music. I don't think there are too many people in the world who say they play backup to Pete Seeger, but Andrew can say that. Pretty amazing. He's written 3 major books on the environment. One of them was made into a program on HBO. Just an exceptional. The stars just keep coming. And then our fourth panelist, Guo Dong, is a PhD from Columbia University. He received all his graduate degrees here. He's a professor here of statistics, and he is also a research fellow at the Earth Institute in the research program on sustainability policy and management. He's been focusing on how we evaluate sustainability policies, and most particularly a relationship that he and Professor Cohen are building with our colleagues in China, working on mutual understanding and most particularly sustainability metrics, which I think is the key to really bringing sustainability policy to scale. So those are the people you're going to be hearing from, and I'm going to go over and sit with them and try to stimulate the beginning of our discussion. So Nilda, we're going to start with you. First question is, how do you stay so young looking? No, that's not
I
really.
have 2 teenage daughters, and I try to keep up with them.
Excellent. I think one question that a lot of people in this field have is that in many quarters, New York City is recognized as a leader in sustainability practices. In some ways, that seems a little odd given the size of the city and the contentiousness of the politics and the demands on public resources. Why do you think New York City has been able to establish itself as a leader in this field, and what's your plan to bring it to the next step?
Well, there are a lot of really smart people here, and there are a lot of folks who know about metrics, and I think that actually makes a difference. So I think this is a place where you have to be, in order to be respected, you have to be substantive at what it is that you do. It's not the sort of place where, you know, you're going to really get away with too much, regardless of, you know, which borough or neighborhood you might go visit. So I think you know, in this role now with the Mayor's Office of Sustainability, one of the things that we are looking at is how do we define sustainability moving forward, and building upon what the last administration did, which was, you know, really very path-breaking. How do we move forward from there? And, you know, what is it that we need to, you know, see within our version of a crystal ball? And I think that's one of the most challenging things. And you know, another thing that also we have to figure out in this office is what are the kind of second and third stages of consequences of the things that we can come up with. So, you know, you might say, okay, well, we should go off and do this, but then really what does that mean, you know, down the road? And I'll give you an example. In Queens, at some point, someone decided that groundwater and, you know, pervious surfaces really should go together. And so as a result, there's not really a great way for Queens to not have flooding. And so, you know, and at the time, everyone thought that this is really, you know, progress. But looking back on it now, it's like, okay, now we have to take another look at these things. And I think a lot of what it means to, you know, be in a city, especially this large and this complicated, is to, you know, be willing to look at, you know, what's beyond what you think is obvious, and, you know, where is it that you need to retrack or you need to, you know, modify things, and also to keep a focus, I think, on the neighborhoods and what's really working, because the geology and, you know, the building types and the people who live in different neighborhoods are, you know, really vastly different. And so what works in one place doesn't necessarily work somewhere else. And so how do you keep that kind of, you know, openness or that sort of flexibility that you need in order to, you know, really be sustainable, not just, you know, in a blanket way for a whole city, but in this kind of mosaic, you know, that we have here.
Great. Steve, you've written a lot about the role that government can play and should play in moving us toward a more sustainable society. Given that much of what people perceive as the non-sustainability problem is in the private sector, and given the word gridlock that we so often now associate with government, how do you see government playing a key role in encouraging or forcing the private sector to adopt more sustainable practices?
I think what's unfortunate about the dialogue, particularly in Washington right now, is there seems to be this idea, and I actually assign it first to Ronald Reagan, who decided that government was a problem. And in fact, it's not that government is not a problem at times. Everybody's a problem at times. But in fact, the way this country became the economic power it is today is because of a partnership between the public and private sector. That's really been the way this country has moved forward, and in fact, it's the way the world has moved forward. So what I often say is that the battle between the communist and the capitalist is over, and both won. We need private enterprise. We need what the private sector can produce. We all live with those things. We wouldn't be happy without them. But we also need to do some things together as a society and collectively. We seem to have forgotten that. So my blog piece this week talks about water in California. And a long time ago, before California was settled to the degree it is now, people there thought about how do we bring water to this part of the country that doesn't have a reliable source of water. Well, the same thing happened here in New York City at the beginning of the 20th century. That's why we get our water from the Croton and the Delaware, and we have this magnificent water system. that predates all of us here. Government has to play that role, and had to play it historically. Now, looking forward, if we're going to move from a fossil fuel-based, one-time use economy to what we're going to have to move to, which is a renewable energy and a renewable resource economy where we pay much more attention to the impacts of human on ecosystems, that's going to require a very sophisticated partnership between the government and the private sector. We're going to have incentives to do the right things through the tax system. We're going to have rules that people are willing to follow. We're going to have incentives. We're going to have federal government money for the basic science of Earth observation that is not being funded adequately today. We're going to need smart grids. We're going to need nanotechnology. We're going to need a whole variety of new approaches, and government has to play a role, and then at a certain point the private sector has to play a role. When we saw that with inventions we use every day, the internet, GPS, laptops, cell phones, the basic technology for all of those things came from the government and then became commercialized. We need that for this part of the economy, so we need to get back to the business of government playing that role. And frankly, if the US government doesn't play that role, there's a lot of other governments. We're in a world economy right now. And so if the United States wants to be competitive in the future, the government and the private sector has to get more sophisticated. And I'll conclude by saying, here in New York City, that's what sustainability planning and management has been about. That's what started in the Bloomberg administration and is being picked up by the de Blasio administration. You end up seeing developers in New York recognizing, for example, that you can't rent Class A office space building in Midtown Manhattan if it doesn't have green building features. That's now part of the commercial equation in this city. And I think that the potential for a sustainable economy is there, but we have to apply the government and the private sector working together. And if we don't do that, we're in deep trouble.
Andrew, you perhaps as much as anybody have written a lot about this subject, and particularly about how we both enlighten and mobilize the public to care about these issues and how they should care about it. I know one of your books is really written so that it can be consumed by a broad mass of people. What's your sense of where the public is, whether it's the public nationally or the public internationally on this topic? You know, there's so much written about, is there even climate change?
Yeah.
What's your sense of where the public is, and how do we move them to the next step, if we can?
Well, there is no single them. That's one thing. There's the developing countries, the people who are fundamentally poor. There's the U.S. and European middle class and the Asian middle class who are mostly consumptive, focused on just getting up the chain of progress. So that's one thing. The entire discussion we're having here, I'm sad to say that we are all sitting not only on the head of a pin in a giant pile of pins, but we're on like the edge of the head of a pin. Just think of this room as it's like right around there. It's a small part of the global discussion of what matters, because mostly individuals are still thinking about getting through the day, avoiding health crises, paying their bills, and most governments are thinking about so many other factors that even in New York, New York has the luxury of having a big sustainability program because it's a pretty prosperous place overall, and we can afford to have those kinds of questions. For a big chunk of the world, these issues, like in California, they only get into the public arena when there's a crisis. The water supply, the history of New York City's water supply grew out of the 1837 cholera epidemic. And if that didn't happen, Alexander Hamilton or whoever it was, I can't remember all the details. I wrote reams about the water supply of New York City. That was a crisis issue, and that's what prompted the realization we can't just drill holes into the ground that we're also putting our excreta into. We have to get it from up there. And then in the 90s, there was the other crisis, which was the EPA saying you're going to have to build a $6 to $10 billion filtration plant, or were you at EPA at that time?
I wasn't here.
And so it was a financial reality. And then some people had the wisdom to say, well, there's these 19 water reservoirs. Maybe we can cut the need to have the mandate to filter if we can keep those stuff out of the reservoirs in the first place, which is incredibly creative, and it's a model that's now being examined by Rio and other cities. So, but you have to have, it seems quite often you have to have the crisis, which is why on climate I don't see, even with Sandy-style issues, the vulnerability to Sandy was an implicit vulnerability to strong hurricanes. That's there with or without global warming. Sea level rise exacerbates the issue. And then, but there you have this other issue that gets in the way. I wrote about Mayor Bloomberg's his last big speech on global warming, introducing this $20 billion plan. It was a lot of creditable elements to that speech, but it was a we will not retreat speech. It was a classic, we will not give up the footprint of the New York City that we know and love, knowing when you look at the models that that's completely untenable, that we need a new way to envision a future for New York City that's softer, that can absorb, I think I see someone in the audience who knows a lot about this, can absorb blows, hydrological blows, and still come out functioning and still be a dense, wonderfully dense, vibrant city. There are ways to do that. But how do we, I'm a communicator, so I played this thought experiment. Imagine you're the press secretary to, let's say, Mayor de Blasio, and he says, okay, let's sit down. I want to write a speech that says, we will retreat. But we'll do it smartly. We'll do it with climate wisdom. We'll do it creatively. We want to smartly retreat. It's like, how do you do? Just put that in your head and think about. It's not doable. So that's the kind of thing we need to invent. Is an awareness, community awareness that can enable the politics, that can enable a mayor to give a speech that says, we will retreat. Using different words in some creative way I haven't thought of yet, to say we need a new city for a new century. And it's a hard, so they're huge challenges. But most of the time, this is the head of a pin in a big pile of pins.
Well, the one place that's related to this topic that's not the head of a pin, or if it is the head of a pin, it's a really big pin, is China.
Yeah.
And, there are so many people who say, without China, certainly without China in the United States, forget any significant impact of sustainability. And the perception from outside China is that China's where the United States was 150 years ago. It's exploding economically, the private sector is growing, damn the torpedoes, full speed ahead, and just because you can't see during the day in Beijing, you got lots of money in your pocket, and you'll enjoy life, party till it's 1999, right? What is the attitude, both in the government but also the public's attitude in China today about these issues, and do you see hope?
Right. I think we understand that China is really the world's biggest greenhouse gas emitter, but I think at the same time China's really been setting out ambitious environmental goals. For example, when President Obama visited China recently, that he agreed with his Chinese counterpart, Chinese President Xi Jinping. Basically, for the first time, the Chinese side agreed to cap the emission level by 2030. So that's a momentous development because that has always been a holdback in the environmental climate talks. But first time you agreed to that. And in addition to that, I think the Chinese side also agreed to increase their energy consumption from zero emission sources to 20% by 2030. And that additional capacity generated will be more than the total coal-fired power plants in China today. And also it almost equates to the total electricity generation of the United States. So that's very significant. But I think at the same time, in order to really achieve those targets to be successful, I think you need buy-ins from the local governments, from the communities, from the public. We all have to act together in this in order to achieve those goals. For example, China is still a very top-down society, so a lot of the initiatives are really made at the top. But then you still need the local officials to help you in that regard, so that those targets get achieved at the local level and then get aggregated at the national level. But then traditionally, the Chinese local officials are evaluated primarily based on their economic performances of their jurisdictions. So that got to change. So the president basically said, well, we can no longer use GDP targets to decide who the party heroes are. That got to change. We have to incorporate more of the environmental and social aspects into the portfolio. So the central government has been emphasizing the link of the civil officials' performance promotions, salaries from raw GDP targets and try to incorporate other things. So I think, unless you do that, we're not going to get anywhere. You have to give them the right incentive. And especially if that's the case, then we have to develop metrics, which, Steve and I have, for that purpose, really, we have established a partnership with the Chinese think tank called the China Center on International Economic Exchanges to establish a set of metrics specifically tailored for Chinese cities. Hopefully, with their influence in the Chinese government, we'll have enough take-up once that's developed by the city governments so that, cross-comparison can happen. So we need that right incentive for the government, local governments especially, to act responsibly. We have to hold them accountable to their words, to their targets. I mean, if you ever go to Beijing, you'll see how bad the air is. If you work for international corporations, sometimes you're paid a compensation, additional compensation, just to live there and breathe the bad air. So that's how bad it is. So basically, and the mayor of Beijing said, our city, because of the pollution, is unlivable. And my job is on the line if I don't cure all the pollution problems. But then again, you really need metrics to hold him accountable to his words and to see how he can make those progress, then compare his performance against his peers. And really make his work count in that respect.
So this is open to everybody, but we'll start with Nilda, if you don't mind. If you had to pick one thing, one achievement, anywhere in the area of sustainability that we've done already that we could point to and say, if we could do it this here, we could do it anywhere. What would you pick?
Actually, a few things come to mind. So one is the negotiations around reducing ozone in the atmosphere, which I think was wildly successful. Clean Water Act and how much better our water quality is. Clean Air Act as well. The air quality has just gotten so much better, not just here in New York City, but lots of other places as well. So those are the kinds of things where, I look at things like, RCRA, CERCLA, that's a different thing, but soil does get cleaned up eventually. But if I look at those examples, then, and you try to think of those in terms of climate change and what it is that you need to do, moving forward, it's not quite as clear yet. And it's the kind of, it's clear where we need to go. But, all the different pieces that you have to put together in order to get there because of, as you say, all the various constituencies and all of the, people who you have to bring along to actually make it happen just becomes, there's many sectors, it just becomes a whole lot more complicated.
See? Well, I think what we've done is we've demonstrated that you don't have to trade off economic development and environmental protection. The story that Nilda's saying is, in fact, if you look at GDP growth in the United States, pollution is growing faster than GDP, but they're both rising in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, and 70s. And then in the 1980s, GDP continues to grow, and absolute pollutant levels continue to shrink and have been shrinking since then. That is an impressive accomplishment, and we've also at the same time demonstrated that the costs of regulation are far lower than the benefits. And this is really one of the problems with this idiotic ideology that we're hearing out of Washington. The concept of a job-killing regulation. Actually, regulations create jobs. Regulations actually create economic growth and create higher quality of life. My favorite story about this is actually Ralph Nader. Unsafe at any speed. If you put seatbelts in cars, well, we'll never be able to sell another car again. So last summer I went and bought a car, and one of the things I was buying it for was its safety. I went to not just look at seatbelts, but airbags and side impact, and it's probably added a couple $1,000s to the cost of a car. But guess what? People actually have to work to manufacture seatbelts. And we end up having many fewer people in getting injured in automobile accidents because of the safety equipment. And so the idea, and it's really a kind of, yes, regulation might kill the jobs in one factory if they're out of date and they refuse to comply with the rules. But if you aggregate it over the whole society, there's no question that environmental regulation in particular pays off at a very massive benefit to cost ratio. And so the separation of this trade-off, the end of this trade-off, I think is becoming more and more understood by more and more people. And in line with that, when I first studied environmental policy in 1975, the environment was a fringe issue. I've been telling the story lately because I was remembering telling my father that I was going to study the environment, and he said, "Oh, how cute. You know, you're going to study the environment, how nice." And then the President of the United States, when he left China and India this year, the central issue was air emissions. Unimaginable 4 decades ago. And so we have made enormous progress. I mean, public policy doesn't solve problems. Public policy makes problems less bad. And so the problem of environmental protection in a global sense is less bad, except in a few areas that we really need some dramatic improvements in. And there, I would say, it's the global problem of climate change that needs the most attention, and is, in some respects, the most difficult policy problem we've ever faced, because it's caused everywhere. It's caused by many of the things we do in our daily lives, and some of its impact is very hard to trace. When I worked in EPA and Superfund, it wasn't hard to figure out where a toxic waste site was and what it was doing to a neighborhood. Climate change is a much more complicated, abstract issue, and it does create communication challenges that are unique. But we, I think, have made enormous progress, and the most enormous progress I think we've made is in people's brains. I think many, many more people understand this problem today than they did in 1975, and that's why I don't think you can predict in a straight line what the world is going to look like 20 or 30 or 40 years from now. I tend to be more optimistic because I think that the capacity for human ingenuity and social learning is great. Otherwise, I probably wouldn't do the job I did.
What's the next big breakthrough, Andrew, that you see? Is it batteries? Is it nano solar?
Well, I agree with Steve. We don't know. Surprises have a habit of surprising us. If you don't mind, I wouldn't mind trying to fill in some of the blanks in that question. And this is not a one thing moment for the human species right now. It's Bill McKibben. He and I disagree on a number of things. One thing I agree with him completely on, this is a silver buckshot issue, not a silver bullet question. Getting humanity through this juncture from Zoom to whatever comes next. But I'll give you just 2 quick examples of really important changes in the world that are momentous. One is in the Amazon, where I wrote my first book about the Amazon deforestation, but way back in 1989. And back then, all the lines were Zoom for deforestation rates, violence rates, murder rates. And just last year, Dan Nepstad, who's been studying the Amazon for decades, had a paper in Science pointing to the decoupling that's happened. The word decoupling, you've already heard it in terms of growth and emissions and pollution. They've decoupled now. Soy production and beef production rates are still going up, but Amazon deforestation is going down. Now, there's lots of fluctuations, and it's not a clear cause and effect thing. And then he pointed in this paper to a series of things that happened that helped to facilitate that change. Governance, indigenous rights, getting rights to their land. And you can look and you start to see these patterns. Decoupling is very powerful. And in China, in Beijing, I was in Beijing a year or 2 ago and met some very creative campaigners on the issue of shark fins. I think this shows you the potential that's out there. You know, shark fin soup, the consumption, the middle class in China, the tradition of having this soup as a celebration. In 2005, some campaigners from Wild Aid and a local NGO did some surveys, and they found out that, you probably can confirm this, the word for shark fin soup in Chinese doesn't include the word shark. At least this is what I've been told.
Right, it's more like fish fin.
Yeah, so how if you want to build a campaign, hey, your soup drinking habits are killing the world's sharks, and you're not aware of that simple fact that the word for this soup doesn't even have the word shark in it, you don't know how to build a campaign. And they built a campaign largely around using social media and celebrities that eventually prompted the government to end their banquets, serving the soup at the banquets, and now the consumption rates for shark fin soup seem to be substantially down, certainly decoupled from the growth of the middle class in China. And all through a very clever, smart, communication-oriented, education communication-oriented practice. I just think these things show great promise. Climate is a whole nother, it's such a different prismatic problem, that it's not quite like that. But these other issues, I think, show real great promise.
Well, I think I can't speak for the United States, but for China, I think the government, because the role of the government in the marketplace is still very dominant, and I think there's a role really to play by the international brands and international suppliers. I think that's probably what we're going to see in the future, because in the developing countries like China, where the environmental regulation is still lacking or not up to the international standards, sometimes you can force the hand of the local supply chains. Well, because the manufacturing sector is one of the biggest polluters, so you can help them improve their sustainability. That's going to help the whole cause. So the international brands and suppliers, when the Western consumers hold them accountable, not only just for their final products, but if we hold them accountable to their parts, where it's sourced, if it's from eco-friendly sources, if they're abusing their supply chain workers and so on, if we hold them accountable to that, it gives them extra incentive to hold their supply chains accountable, which may be 1,000 miles away. So those supply chains, those manufacturers may be really small in scale. They don't have the incentive to make changes on them on their own, because the cost may be too high. So we need the suppliers, their buyers, basically, to give them the extra incentive, maybe giving them extra contracts if they can try to improve sustainably. So I think without the government regulation, the international buyers, the international retailers and brands really have an important role to play in this. I think that's what we're going to see in the future. That's going to happen more and more.
What about, we'll open it up to the audience in a minute, but what about the role of leadership? So many of these breakthroughs happen because there's a person. Historically, you look at changes in medical procedures. There were people who stood up and galvanized the public on it. In the rights movements, we see, we've been talking a lot about human rights here in the U.S. and individuals. Are there any emerging leaders on this environmental sustainability issue that maybe could galvanize large numbers of people behind it, Dr. Cohen?
I think there's a whole generation. I don't think it's going to be sort of the great person theory here. I think what you're seeing is, if there's a paradigm shift going on, it's with younger people who have grown up with these ideas from the moment they started elementary school. And I think there's tremendous hope in the fact that the students that we teach in our programs and the young people that we see are pushing in this direction. And so the changes are happening simultaneously at the governmental level, in the media, among the culture, and I think a lot of cultural shifts. There was an article about in the Times last week about how in the past mass transportation only increased when gasoline prices went up. And in the last year, gasoline prices went down and mass transit went up. And we're seeing among young people a desire to get away from the suburban lifestyle with a lawn and fertilizer and driving everywhere to go everywhere. So there's more of a desire to go back to communities and into cities and use mass transit. All of that's coming, I think. I see it as a cultural change. It's the same cultural change that is getting people to pay more attention to nutrition and exercise and what's coming into their body. And I think that that's something that today's young people have grown up with. It's something that people of my age had to learn how to do, sometimes the hard way. And I think that that's a sea change. And that's where, so the leadership that I think is coming is a mass leadership, not the leadership of an individual or of a great person.
Anyone want to drop one more bomb here before we open it up to the audience?
I don't know about bomb, but, but no, just to kind of build on what Steve was just saying. So in the time that I've been involved in this area, when I was first in law school, I could not take an environmental law class. They just didn't offer it. They sort of offered it maybe, every other year if they could find the right teacher, whatever, but it wasn't really embedded in it, and that was at Harvard. And so when
Have they started doing that now?
Yeah, now they're good. They have a clinic, you know.
It's such a small school, though.
Yeah. So, but you know, and so what I found is that when I was first starting out in my career doing this, I had to make up a lot of stuff along the way, and so did everybody else who was doing it, because we really didn't have, you know, sort of like a set path, and that was actually part of the appeal for me and a lot of the other people going into this field, was that there was still you could be very creative, and you could still, you know, sort of think about, how do I get to where I think we should go, and what are all the things that we need to do in order, you know, to get us there, and you could, you know, really sort of make it happen. What I am especially encouraged by now is that it's not really so much that way anymore. So, you know, what I find is that, you know, with the people who I work with, you know, in the city and, you know, outside, is that there's a level of expertise and a level of competence and enthusiasm and creativity that's there. So there's a deep kind of, you know, really a deep sort of expertise as well as appreciation for the issue. And I think that the only way you can really be effective on this stuff is to have this sort of level of expertise, whether it be in the areas of finance or whether it be, you know, scientific or, you know, ecological or communications or, you know, whatever else it is, because you need all of those skills in order to move things forward. So that to me is what gives me the most hope, is that we could actually operationalize, we'd actually implement things that in the past we really couldn't figure out quite how to do.
Last words. There's so many things. I'd rather save time to go to the audience. I could come up with my answers. I can fit them in if I need to.
Sounds good. Questions, ladies and gentlemen? Somebody's got to be first. There we go. We have a microphone coming.
I want to pick up on your leadership question, because what the question for me is, maybe and hopefully it'll be a mass leadership, but it would be even stronger if there were national leaders in this area. And why don't we have them now? We have national environmental organizations. We have no national spokespeople for this issue. That is, in my mind, the most important issue we have in this world right now. And what's keeping that from happening?
Well, to some extent, I think to some extent, people your age and my age, we pine for the days, like in the 60s, when I could turn on the TV and there would be Jacques Cousteau. You know, but that was the days when we all watched 3 channels of TV. So you needed, Walter Cronkite, you know, told us that's the way it is, and we didn't have to even think about anything. So we were told the way it is. Now we're saddled with, and in a way have an opportunity to have a very deconstructed sense of the way it is. So we're in a leaders matter. Obviously, they matter in terms of things like legislation, or Ban Ki-moon. I think actually Ban Ki-moon has been a great spokesman for his Sustainable Energy for All push. It's been fantastic because it acknowledges both ends of the landscape. People need more energy, but we need to deal with carbon dioxide. But he's not a mass leader. Pope Francis, I spent 4 days at the Vatican last year at a meeting on sustainable humanity, sustainable planet, our responsibility, that was facilitated by his interest in these issues. And of course, this year he's coming out with some strong leadership that goes beyond. Actually, I think he said once that he thinks more non-Catholics listen to him than Catholics. I'm pretty sure. So he's got a bully pulpit, you know, like the bulliest pulpit of all. So they're out there, but in the end, I think it's really a post-leadership model. It's all the little leaders you see. There's an innovative young elementary school teacher in my town in the Hudson Valley who, despite the onerous testing stuff, has come up with creative ways to use webcams on the school property to look at wildlife. I mean, those are the real leaders of our age.
Yeah, I want to echo that, because I think it's a lot of the graduates of our programs running community-based organizations and working at that level that are, you know, making the change that we're looking for. And yeah, I mean, I think there are some national spokespeople. There are some people that I look to and that I read, and I know that the other people on this panel look to and read. But there isn't a Martin Luther King of the environment, and I think Andy, you may be right. It may be much harder for those kinds of leaders to emerge. I do think that President Obama has emerged in some respects as a spokesperson. I'm a little terrified of what might happen if somebody like Ted Cruz became president. I forget who said it, they took LSD throughout the 60s, but nothing prepared them for Ted Cruz. I think that there is an issue of why is something like breathing and eating unpoisoned food and drinking fresh water, why would that be political and controversial and ideological? That's completely crazy. It wasn't at the beginning of the environmental movement, and I think at the local level, when you talk to people, in Charleston, West Virginia last summer, they were pretty concerned about the quality of toxics in their water. So that's where I think we're going to see that leadership.
Good evening. There's a lot of useful discussion, particularly at the Earth Institute, about the leadership of science and economists and the leadership of national groups and the national government. But I think there are two that you haven't talked about a lot. I'd be curious about the view of them. Bill, you have a little bit, but one is the new leadership of cities, which seem to be much more active and involved in dealing with climate change than nation states are.
Yeah.
Copenhagen, Mayor Jensen or Mayor Ferguson in Bristol, or Mayor Trias in Barcelona, or Rio Pass. You have cities and mayors sort of engaged in struggles, 40 Italy and other organizations. So I'd be curious about the view what cities, not just New York, but what cities and role cities can play. The other is we really talked about individuals, some nice anecdotal about individuals. We haven't talked about popular movements. And my wife, who was sitting here, was actually on the committee that over a year organized the People's Climate March last September. It turned out, to everybody's surprise, 400,000, more than 30,000 people. It created a kind of groundswell that made it easier for politicians and other leaders to do their work. And sometimes I think the danger here is that there's so much emphasis on technology solutions that we forget that the politics of implementing those solutions depend on a popular support that has to be generated at the city level and the popular movement level. I wonder if
I don't think there's a single answer. I think we need all of these things. The book that Bill and I and Allison Miller wrote actually focused much more on local government than anything else. And Bill was an official in New York's government at the state and local level. So we think a lot about that. I think all of those things are what's happening, and I think the local and state is important. But I also think, you know, I'm a lobbyist here for the Earth Institute and our scientists, and they're writing 10 times as many proposals for the same amount of research funding as they got 10 years ago, which is dangerous when our scientists are spending all their time hustling for dollars. When we really need them in laboratories doing research work. I think that there's a tremendous need for more knowledge about the planet. If you look at Earth observation, if we're going to manage our economy to not destroy the planet, we really better know a lot more about those impacts. So it's not just technological solutions, it's understanding of what's going on around here. And we need to do a lot more than we're doing. You know, that's, I think, a large part of it. But I don't want to criticize any one element. I think the climate march was terrific. I think that, you know, I mean, I came out of the anti-war movement. I certainly understand the importance of mass mobilization. But I think we need all of these things. And a lot of it depends on your own talents and your own disposition.
So if I might just add a little bit of information on New York City. So one of the things that happened around the time of the climate march last fall was that Mayor de Blasio announced that the city was setting a target of reducing greenhouse gas emissions 80% by 2050, which is a very ambitious goal, but also rooted in you know, the amounts of research saying that that was really where we needed to go. And so the mayor at that time, and still, I mean, continues to, we all within the administration look at this as an opportunity to set an example, you know, for other cities, because so much of the population is moving into cities, and it'll be the majority living in cities by, I forget what the year is, but it's not that far off in the future.
Well, it's happened already.
Sorry?
2007.
There we are. So, thank you.
Steve counted them.
Personally.
And then there's you, and so, but it's funny because like for me personally, one of the reasons that I'm working in the city is because I have very little optimism about what's going on in DC after all of the years, that I was there. And so, myself as well as many other urban sustainability directors, firmly believe that, we have to lead by example, and we have to do what we can do within our areas and build on that, to go forward.
Can I add a point to that?
Please.
I think the central leadership is still very important, especially in places like China. And last year, the president basically proposed this new concept because of the economic reality, not just in China, but also across the world, that what he called the new normal. I mean, it's quite complicated. It's basically have twofold meaning: slower growth, but with higher quality. That's quite, it's not that complicated. It's a very simple concept. But then because of that concept, I think a lot of the local governments start scripting their GDP targets. The GDP targets is what the governments emphasize in China. But they start scripting that. 70 cities last year scripted their GDP targets. And for the first time this year, the city of Shanghai, which is really the commercial center of China, abandoned its GDP target as well. That's a momentous development. So you can see that although the agenda at the central level still dictates the policies, but it's really the urban government who makes the most innovative programs. And I think because they know better about the local needs, they have more resources at their disposal to really make this impact. And I think we have what we call the DAD approach, the decide, announce, and defend approach when it comes to infrastructure projects for local governments. So basically, they come together when it's an infrastructure project. They come together with a bunch of experts, and they make a decision, and they announce to the public. And when the public protests, they defend it. But without involving the communities that affect the communities, the public, in the planning process. So that's heavily criticized. So they have to involve those different stakeholders in the planning process to make this a better outcome. At least you can avoid the risk of outright cancellation of some of the good projects. So I think all this can happen at the local level. I think the local governments, the cities can play a very important role in this. Although it's really the central government who makes the overall agenda, but I think it's local governments who has the most say in this.
Question from over here? Maybe in the middle there, the young woman? Yes.
So as a follow-on question to what you were just talking about, I realize that you all are probably more knowledgeable about New York, but given what's going on in California right now, what's the way through for the state and the surrounding states, because they're also struggling with drought?
Well,
that was Jerry Brown.
It's a complicated story in California. The population is, people want to go there. I mean, we're losing population in the Northeast where we have plenty of water, and people want to live in California in the Southwest for reasons that elude me and for many of the people here, because we like it here, but they love it there. And so the question is, how do you deal with water scarcity in that environment? And I think what Governor Brown just announced is a very important first step of saying we're going to reduce consumption and we're going to start thinking about agricultural use of water. And that's how it starts. And these things start with small steps. It's going to change. I mean, I thought the mayor of Los Angeles was quoted in the Times over the weekend. I think he's right. It's going to change the way California lives, but it's not going to change the optimism and the growth dynamic that's out there, I think. But it remains to be seen.
Well, I had a theory. It was just tickling the back of my head. I wrote about this yesterday, like Steve did, but I didn't include this. That maybe Jerry Brown's idea was by leaving out agriculture and doing the first sort of cuts requiring from the voters, essentially, he's going to use that to piss them off, so that they then say, "But the real villain is agriculture. We're growing alfalfa in California and rice and almonds and maybe he was doing this. I don't know. This would be very Machiavellian, but I could see a really smart mayor.
It's a family tradition.
Say, well, let me piss off the voters so they become my ally, and then forcing agriculture to get serious too.
It doesn't sound like Jerry Brown, actually.
No, I don't think it is, but I'm sure maybe it could be. Maybe it could be. It's a nutty situation. And the agriculture stuff. We did a piece, there was an op-ed in the New York Times in 2007 by two smart a climate scientist and another analyst in Alabama saying, bring your agriculture down here. This is where we have the water, you know, and this idea that the Imperial Valley, by the way, agriculture is like this tiny part of California's GDP. I think it's at 2%. It's ridiculous. So the idea that this is an economic imperative, that we must continue to grow our alfalfa in California, is silly. So that's going to change. Whether it's through a Machiavellian pressure or something else, it's going to change.
Well, nationally, agriculture at the beginning of the 20th century employed 40% of the country. Now it's about 1.1%. So there's very little question that it's not as important as it was, although we still all like to eat.
Yeah, but do it where the water is, you know, would be a good thing.
Yes, that's not a bad idea.
We've got time for one more question, so I'll leave it to my colleague to pick. Go ahead, you pick.
Hi, it's Julie Tucker. Let's see, how can I answer this? I guess the thing that I've noticed recently is the climate deniers they're arguing the wrong thing. Instead of saying, you know, the constituents having to, you know, represent constituents. So why is the economic barrier, which it seems like is the barrier, not being talked about more? I mean, and is that being talked about in Congress? You know, let's work out the economic difficulty of taking jobs away from people who make money off pollution and transforming them instead of just throwing snowballs on the floor.
Well, we're starting that. I mean, the thing that I don't know that the Obama administration is getting enough credit for. Yes, we didn't get climate legislation out of the Congress, but they took the Clean Air Act and they've started to regulate greenhouse gases as an air pollutant. Now, anybody who works in EPA knows that this is a decade-long process to get a regulation
At least
promulgated and implemented in the real world, but at the same time, it sends a very strong signal that this is going to be the rule at some point, and the smarter corporations start to adapt to that early, understanding that that's going on. So I think you're beginning to see that signal. The problem in general with climate is that we really rely on energy in every part of our lives, and we are all addicted to fossil fuels. So the question is, how do we make that transition without destroying the economic life that we all enjoy, and that in fact the poorest people are the most vulnerable to the rises of the prices that might come from regulation. So that's really where you need to have science and technology come in and somehow develop a set of energy sources that are less expensive than fossil fuels, and that in essence drive that out of the marketplace. And again, that requires creativity, it requires government action, it requires economic mobilization, none of which is ever easy. But I think that there's no single issue that's more important right now in the world than making that transition from fossil fuels to renewable energy. So I have to believe, and we're certainly trying to work on it in the Earth Institute, that the best minds of the generation that is coming up are thinking about these issues and are working on it. And because I'm optimistic and I believe in the power of knowledge and human ingenuity, I think that they'll be solved. But it won't be easy and it won't be simple, and there'll be some forces in our society that will fight it at every turn.
Well, before we imbibe, which I invite you all to do, I'll take one prerogative of the chair and say that on an optimistic note, many of you may not be aware that the largest solar facility, the largest solar plant in the Americas is under construction in, of all places, Buffalo, New York. And it's a public-private partnership between the state of New York and the state university and Elon Musk, who some of you know from spaceships and Tesla cars. So to me, that's extremely optimistic, and I think it gets to the point that Steve was talking about earlier, and that is environmental protection and sustainability are not necessarily in conflict with economic development and economic growth. This will be the largest new factory in upstate New York in 40 years. So I really believe these two trends can come together. Before you share some food and drink with us, may I ask you please to thank our panelists for what I think was a wonderful presentation.